So, welcome back. Now we'll get into some more foundational concepts that you'll see over and over again in your cybersecurity journey: networks and network models. Before we get into it, I'd like to take a look at this video of the solar system. The solar system is a really complex thing, but I think this provides a nice model of what's going on and how it works. I'm hoping to provide that kind of a picture for you of computer networking and the OSI model in this lesson. It's a complex thing, but here we'll get just a high level picture of what's going on, and I hope it makes it clear for you. Let's get started. So, in this lesson, we'll talk about what a computer network is, and we'll describe the OSI model at a high level. So, what is a network? At its most basic level, a network is two or more computers linked together sharing data and resources. There are different types of network. A LAN is a local area network, so a network that's usually just restricted to a single building. A WAN is a wide area network, so that's usually over a large geographic area like a university campus and includes multiple buildings. A WLAN is a wireless LAN, so this is like your home Wi Fi network. And a VPN is a virtual private network. You're probably used to connecting to a VPN for work, and it allows you to connect over the internet in a secure way and uses encryption to keep that connection secure. Some devices found on networks include hubs and switches, which are used to connect nodes together on the network, on the same network, and routers, which are used for routing traffic between networks, and then firewalls, which are used for filtering traffic between networks. Servers are computers that are used to provide a particular service, like a mail server or a print server. And endpoints are all the end user devices, like laptops, desktops, phones, that type of thing. So we're going over a lot of different terminology here, and I'm providing a list of terminology in the written lesson in this module. There's also a glossary in the resources section of this course. I usually use the definitions from NIST Computer Security Resource Center, which I think is a really good resource for you to check out. Okay, so what is the OSI model? OSI stands for Open Systems Interconnection Model, and it describes the universal standard mechanisms for communication in a computer network. The open systems part of it refers to how this model applies to any computer network, regardless of the technology stack being used. So I like to think of it as, as an analogy that I like to use is how a car works. No matter what kind of car you drive, a Ford, a Toyota, a fancy BMW, regardless of the make and the manufacturer, the principles of how a car works are the same. And the OSI model is a reference of how computer networking works. It's just an abstract idea, and it's going to be different in every computer network, but the principles of the model apply. Another concept here is data encapsulation and de encapsulation. As data travels through this abstract idea of the OSI reference model, different headers and footers and information about routing and things like that are being added to the data and stripped off as it goes from layer to layer. And each layer depends on the layers beside it. So one layer will depend on something coming from the other layer and provide something for the next layer. So I just want you to think about that as you're trying to understand how the OSI model works and how computer networking works. As kind of a quick idea, if you look at this image on the screen, if you type something into your laptop, you can imagine it kind of traveling down these layers I show here. All these different things are happening in each layer. And then as your input, has some kind of reaction and that reaction comes back to you, it comes back up those layers to you at your laptop. That's kind of the idea, the picture that I'm trying to draw here when I describe the OSI model. Okay, so here's a picture of what the OSI model contains. It has 7 layers. You see them on the left-hand side there. They're numbered 1 through 7. Each layer has a name, and the layer at the top, the application layer, is the one that's closest to humans. So that's kind of the one that you first interact with, and then everything else kind of happens under the hood. So Again, I'm going to use a car analogy here where if you think about your steering wheel, that's kind of your interface to your car, and then everything else is happening under the hood. And that's what you can think of here. So we'll kind of walk through these different layers and give you a high level idea of what's happening at each layer. Packets are going to be going through each layer with headers and footers being added and removed as they go along. And those things are going to help make sure that the packets don't get lost and remain together and things like that. In the next lesson, we're going to go into each of these layers a little bit in more depth. So don't worry if we're kind of going through them quickly here. So with the physical layer has to do with the transmission of the data over physical medium, so cables and circuits and that type of thing. Then you move up from the bottom to layer 2, the data link layer, and that's going to pertain to how data moves between nodes. It provides some error checking and creates the actual data packets that are going to be sent over the network. Then you have the network layer, and this pertains to how the data is forwarded as packets between networks, and it determines the path used for transfer. So all of the addressing and routing and things like that, that's going to be focused on in the network layer. Then you have layer 4, the transport layer. This has to do with how data is delivered to application processes, and we'll talk more about protocols in later lessons, but the TCP and UDP protocols are going to come up in this layer, so you're going to want to remember that, and having to do with how the data arrives in the same order it was sent and is not duplicated and lost and things like that. So the reliability layer is how I like to think of the transport layer. Then you have layer 5, the session layer. This pertains to how data is managed in sessions and end user applications, and everything related to authentication and authorization happens in this layer. Then you have the presentation layer, layer 6. This is where formatting and translation and a lot of the encryption happens, all about getting data into the right format to be used in other layers. And then finally, you have the application layer, layer 7. As I mentioned before, this is the layer that's closest to humans. This is where the user interface happens. This is where the application programming interfaces live. So that, layer that's the closest to the humans where they're interacting with an application. Okay, so just as an example, and kind of what I talked about before, you can imagine you're at computer A, you have a friend at computer B, you chat to them on a application like Slack or something like that. Good morning, have you had your coffee yet? And that information is going to travel down from your computer through the application layer and all the other layers below that. It's going to go through the presentation layer where it's kind of translated into computer speak, so to speak. And then your session's going to be authenticated in the session layer. And then the reliability of the message going through is going to be in the transport layer. The routing of the message is going to be handled in the network layer. Some error checking and packet creation is going to happen in the data link layer. And then it's going to be transmitted over the physical wires and everything at the physical layer and travel over to that computer B where your friend is, and everything's going to kind of happen in reverse order, going up to the application layer where your friend's going to see your message and respond. So that just gives you kind of an idea of how that's happening under the hood. Okay, no discussion of the OSI model would be complete if it didn't contain at least one mnemonic device to help you remember the layer names. A mnemonic device is basically a phrase that helps you remember a list of things in the proper order. I'm actually going to give you 3 mnemonic devices to choose from, and you can pick the one that you remember best. These list the layers in order from layer 1, physical, to layer 7, application. So you can remember the first letter of the words physical, data link, network, transport, session, presentation, and application. And the 3 phrases I have for you are: for pet lovers, please do not touch Steve's pet alligator. For pizza lovers, we have please do not throw sausage pizza away. And for fans of Lord of the Rings, we have please do not throw Smeagol's precious away. Now you're going to want to remember more about the layers than just their names, but this is still a handy tool to use to jog your memory. Okay, so in this lesson, we talked about what a network is and some of the terminology related to networking. And then we went over the OSI model at a high level and talked about what that is. In the next lesson, we'll get into the OSI model just a little bit deeper and look at the layers and also talk about the TCP IP model. I'll see you there. So, welcome back. Now we'll continue our talk about network models. We're going to discuss the OSI model a little bit more in depth, and then we're going to describe how it differs from the TCP IP model. So, just as a review, here's a view of the OSI model that we talked about in the last lesson. Now we'll go over it a little bit more layer by layer, and I'll give you some key highlights to know about each layer. The physical layer, or layer one. Some of these layers I'm going to highlight whether there's an address type you should know and what devices and data types are associated with the layers. In this case, there's no address type to know about, but you should know the devices, which are cables, network cards, and hubs. This is where the data is moving over physical medium. But since there's no addresses here, it's sort of a dumb layer. You don't have a lot of information about where the data needs to go at this point, but it'll get more information as it travels through the different layers. Hubs broadcast data on all ports without using any specific addresses. So that's why you don't have that type of information at this level. Then you move on to the data link layer. The data link layer is associated with how data moves between nodes and uses MAC addresses. So that's the address associated with this layer. A MAC address is a media access control address, which is like a serial number for a node. It is 48 bits long. The first 24 bits are an identifier for the manufacturer, and the second 24 bits are the unique identifier for the network interface or node. So you can see here now we're starting to talk about, okay, where does this data need to go? And it's a MAC address that's going to tell you that. MAC addresses should always be globally unique. And it's also important to note that since there's an address here, it's susceptible to spoofing. So, a bad actor could spoof a MAC address and confuse the switch that is going to send the data, and so that the traffic is redirected. It impersonates the legitimate device, and that device, the impersonated device, receives the device's traffic instead of the real device that it's supposed to go to. The data type is an Ethernet frame, which you can see depicted here, and you can see that it contains multiple parts. These parts get stripped off as the data moves through the layers, but think of it as, providing all the information about what the data is and where it needs to go. And if you think about it, the further away from the destination the data is, the more information is needed to get it where it needs to go. So I kind of think about it as if I want an alien from outer space to find my house, it's going to need to know the house number, the street name, the town, the country, the planet, and the universe I'm in. But if I just want a neighbor a couple of doors down to know where I live, they just need to know my house number. So that kind of gives you an idea of how these different pieces of the data Ethernet frame are used and how you can strip them off as it moves through the different layers of the OSI model and sort of evolves into packets and things like that. The network layer is layer 3, and this is associated with data being forwarded as packets and determines the path used to transfer the data across the network. The address type here is an IP address. You've probably heard of IP addresses since they sort of underlie the key parts of the URLs that we use to identify resources on the internet. You can see an example IP address here, 192.168.3.1. And the devices used in this layer are routers and firewalls. So those are those devices we've mentioned before that transfer data between networks. As I mentioned, the data type is called a packet here. So it's basically the same data, but it's now in a sort of a different format. And it has, you can see it stripped down from what that Ethernet frame looked like. Oh, another thing is that the since we have an address here, again, we have an IP address, it's also susceptible to spoofing. So once again, someone could spoof that IP address, redirect traffic to a different location, and it can also pave the way for things like man in the middle attacks and session hijacking. And we'll talk about attacks later, but I just want to kind of plant the seed for you of how these things can happen. Okay, so the transport layer, layer 4, is where data is delivered to application processes. And this is where a couple of protocols come in, TCP and UDP protocols. And these ensure that data arrives in the same order it was sent and it's not duplicated. It's good to know a little bit more about those protocols. TCP, Transmission Control Protocol, is more reliable but requires more overhead. It has sort of a handshake that happens that says, "Hey, I'm going to send you data. Okay, I'm ready to get the data. Okay, I'm sending the data." So it has a lot of back and forth over whether or not the data is being sent and who, whether the recipient received it. Um, On the other hand, the UDP protocol, user datagram protocol, is more of a broadcast type protocol and it's less reliable. But we use it for things like streaming because it's faster and it doesn't require all of that overhead. The idea is just to transmit the data and not be so concerned about whether it was received. Netflix just sends you a show that you want to watch. It doesn't care if you saw it, it doesn't care if you walked out of the room while it was playing. It's just broadcasting that information. The address type in this layer is the ports. So data is being sent over certain ports, and that's happening in this layer. And the device types here, again, are routers and firewalls because we're still talking about transmitting data between networks. And you can see that the data type is segments. And again, it's more stripped down from the previous layer. Okay, session layer is layer 5, and this layer is related to managing data in sessions and end user applications. I like to think about this layer when I think about logging into my bank's online banking site. So it's all concerned about authorization, authentication, opening that session, closing that session when you're done, sort of all the things you care about when you want to make sure that everything is secure and you're authenticated and everything like that. So that's usually what I think about in this layer. There's not any more that you have to worry about here as far as data types and things like that. We're still talking about packets here and things, but the most important thing for you to know about this layer is sort of what the layer is for. And here we go with the presentation layer, layer 6. This layer is all about translating the data between, basically what computers understand and what humans understand, as well as encrypting data when necessary and sometimes compressing it, providing it in different formats. That's what this layer is all about. And the application layer is layer 7. As we mentioned before, this is the layer closest to humans, and it's related to everything about the application interfaces that we interact with. Okay, so switching gears a little bit to the TCP/IP model. This is like the original gangster when it comes to network models in the internet age. If you remember back in the lesson on CIA triad, we talked about that time when the internet was new and people were just learning how to use it. And, times were simpler then. The TCP/IP model only has 4 layers to represent what the OSI model represents in 7 layers. So the OSI model is sort of like the more modern version that is more fine-grained than the TCP/IP model. So let's take a look at these 2 models next to each other. And you can see that if you start from the bottom, the link layer in the TCP/IP model is, both the physical layer and data link layer rolled up into one. And then the internet layer is layer three in the OSI model. We call it the network layer, but in the TCP/IP model, we call it the internet layer. And then the next layer is transport layer, so it has the same name as the one in the OSI model, but here it's layer 3. And then finally, the TCP/IP model just has one application layer that represents everything rolled up that we show as the session layer, presentation layer, and application layer in the OSI model. Um, in addition to, knowing the differences between these models, I think it's kind of interesting to see how they're rolled up, the different layers in the TCP/IP model, because in the OSI model, it's true that the session layer, presentation layer, and application layer are sort of all related to those applications, right? So they have some um, relation to the applications that are being used. And so it's kind of nice to see, okay, if I want to kind of break the OSI model up into segments, that's a logical way to think about those 3 layers. And then if I want to break up transport layer and network layer, I can kind of think about, okay, this is sort of the networky part of the layers here. And then data link layer and physical layer, both being, in the link layer, that's not quite as helpful because there's you still need to remember that physical layer where things are at that physical medium level. But anyway, it's just kind of an interesting way that I look at things. I hope maybe looking at that is helpful for you as well. And there's not really a good mnemonic for the TCP/IP model. There's an acronym you could think of, LIDA, LITA, link internet transport application. But it's just four things, so you might not need some handy dandy way to remember it. Okay, so this was another long lesson. I hope that you got something out of it. We discussed the OSI model layer by layer, and we talked about how it compares to the TCP/IP model. I'll see you in the next lesson. So, welcome back. Now we'll get into two other foundational concepts in networking and cybersecurity: ports and protocols. Our objectives are to identify some common ports and protocols and then identify which ports and protocols are secure versus insecure. This should start to raise your awareness of why these concepts are so important for cybersecurity. What is a port? Sort of like the name implies, a port is an entry point. I like to think of a port like a doorway. Ports can be opened or closed like a doorway. Network administrators will purposely close ports to increase security, and they can also designate which ports will be used for a given protocol or service. In some cases, there are special ports that are always used for certain protocols, and we'll get into what a protocol is next. A protocol is a standard or set of rules for communication. I like to think of a protocol like a language that has rules about grammar and punctuation and so forth. If you know the rules of a language, you can communicate with other people who also know those rules. It's the same with a protocol. Everyone has to follow the rules of a given protocol in order for that type of communication to work. Each protocol has its own purpose. Now let's talk about the difference between secure and insecure ports and protocols. Imagine a door that has no lock versus one that has a deadbolt and an alarm. For protocols, you could think of a language or code that anyone could easily understand or crack. Like when I was a kid, we thought it was fun to use Pig Latin to confuse our friends, but they could typically easily figure it out. This is in contrast to a highly sophisticated and encrypted code that is not possible to understand without a key. Now we'll talk about some of the most common ports and protocols that you'll see referenced in relation to networking and cybersecurity. There are many more than those that we'll discuss here, but if you at least know the ones we're going to talk about, you'll have a good foundation to build upon. We've already talked about some protocols, such as TCP and UDP. And as you probably already know, IP or Internet Protocol is associated with getting the address to which to send your data, whereas TCP is all about sending the data once you have that address and ensuring that the message went through. UDP is also about communicating the data, but with low latency and loss tolerance. In other words, broadcasting a message to get it out quickly without a lot of concern for whether it was received. Note that TCP and UDP can occur on various ports, so unlike some other protocols we'll talk about next, you'll see TCP and UDP occur on many ports. Before we get into these ports and protocols, I want to remind you of a theme we've been talking about from the beginning. Networking and the internet were wild and free in the beginning, and then as people got smarter about it, they realized they needed to make it more secure. This is true with ports and protocols as well. We started out with non secure ones and then we added security. Now, just because we have secure versions doesn't mean everyone uses them. So you'll still see the insecure ones in use, and that's where cybersecurity comes in. As a cybersecurity professional, it's important to recognize secure versus non secure ports and protocols and when and why they are being used. Okay, let's talk through the ones I have on this slide. Generally speaking, the ones on the left are non secure and the ones on the right are secure. But typically, making something secure is a matter of adding encryption. So some of these can be either non secure or secure depending on whether something like encryption has been added. Okay, FTP and SFTP. These are easy to me because the name tells you what they are: File Transfer Protocol and Secure File Transfer Protocol. You guessed it, these are for transferring files. I think about these when I need to deliver a file that's really large and I use something like Box or Dropbox. These ports are these protocols rather are on ports 21 and 22. SFTP uses SSH, which also happens on port 22, and we'll talk about that next. So that one is, you need to remember that SFTP and SSH both happen on port 22, whereas FTP happens on port 21. Now there's another secure version of FTP, FTPS, which is FTP with SSL encryption, and I talk about that a little bit more in the written part of this lesson. Telnet is a protocol that's used to log into another computer on the same network. I like to think of it as the teleport protocol because it's like you're teleporting yourself to that other computer. SSH is the secure version of the same thing. You will often hear network administrators say things like, I'm going to SSH into that server. And that means they're going to securely log into that other server remotely, kind of creating a portal to that server. SMTP is Simple Mail Transport Protocol. This is one of the various protocols associated with email, and this one focuses on sending the email to the email server. SMTP happens on port 25 and port 587. Typically, it's only used between email servers for relaying messages, whereas port 587 provide, the same network within protocols are, And we talked about some of the common ports and protocols you should know. We also talked about what ports and protocols are secure versus insecure and why that matters. I hope you've gotten a lot out of this lesson. I encourage you to study these things and review them and internalize them. This is the kind of information you really need to go back and do self study on. And it's going to be, maybe a little bit dry, but I hope that I've indicated here why it's so important to know this stuff. Okay, I'll see you in the next lesson.